The world was teeth, and the wind was its breath. It came down from the black mountains of Montana, a solid wall of white that cared nothing for the living. The snow did not fall. It flew sideways, stinging like buckshot, erasing the line between the gray sky and the frozen earth. Below the timberline, the pines groaned under the weight of the ice, their branches snapping with reports like distant rifle fire. And beneath that, another sound, the long, hollow cry of a wolf, answered by its brothers across the ridge. It was the sound of hunger, the anthem of the wilderness. Mara felt the sound in her bones, a cold that went deeper than the storm. She was riding a line that did not exist, following a memory of a creek bed that was now buried under 3 feet of powder. The mare beneath her stumbled, its breath coming in ragged, steaming bursts. The horse was done. It had given all it had, running for 2 days on panic in air. Mara clung to the saddle horn, her body rigid. She wore a man's heavy wool cloak, stolen from a peg by the door, but it was not enough. The wind found every gap, tearing at her with invisible claws. Under the cloak, the remnants of her wedding dress were frozen stiff. The delicate lace, meant for a parlor in Helena, was ripped to shreds by briars. The silk was plastered to her skin, and the tiny seed pearls sewn onto the bodice felt like chips of ice against her ribs. She had been a bride for 6 hours. It felt like a lifetime ago. Another life, belonging to another woman, one who was foolish enough to think a vow could be anything other than a chain. The mare staggered again, its shoulder dipping hard. Mara cried out, a thin sound swallowed by the gale. "No, please, not yet, just a little further." The horse did not hear, or did not care. It lunged forward, fighting the drift, and then its forelegs punched through a crust of ice into nothing. It was the river. Mara was thrown clear of the saddle as the mare screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of animal terror. She landed hard on her side, the air driven from her lungs. She saw the horse struggling in the black, churning water, its head held high as the current grabbed its legs. Then the current grabbed Mara. She felt the icy water swallow her boot, pulling her in. She scrambled, grabbing at the bank, but the snow and frozen mud gave way. The weight of the cloak, now saturated, became an anchor. The cold was a shock so profound it burned all thought from her mind. It was a solid, crushing weight. She was dragged under, her feet tangled in the remnants of the dress. The water was black, fast, and full of jagged ice. She fought, her arms flailing, but the cloak was a shroud, pulling her down into the darkness. Not like this was her only thought. Not after running so far. Her hand struck something solid, a rock. She clung to it, gasping, managing to get her head above the surface. She coughed, spitting out water that tasted of mud and iron. She saw the mare 50 yards downstream, only its head visible, rolling in the rapids before vanishing under the ice shelf. A sound, a low curse, cut through the wind. She could not turn her head. Her neck was too stiff. A shape was moving on the bank. A tall man layered in furs and buckskin. He was holding a rifle in one hand and a length of rope in the other. He waded into the shallows, the water churning around his knees, his face hidden by a low-furred hat and a thick beard frosted with ice. "Grab it!" he yelled. His voice was rough, like gravel rolling downhill. He threw the rope. It landed across her shoulders. Her fingers were numb, useless. She tried to close her hand around the braided hemp, but her muscles would not obey. "Damn it, womans, grab the rope!" He saw her fumbling. With another curse, he tossed the rifle onto the bank and lunged forward, grabbing the front of her cloak. The material ripped, but his grip held. He was immensely strong. He hauled her from the water like a snagged log, dragging her up onto the frozen bank. She collapsed onto the snow, coughing and shaking so violently her teeth rattled. She was dying. She knew it. The cold was inside her now, settling into her heart. The man stood over her, breathing hard. He looked down at her, at the ruined lace visible where her cloak had torn open. His eyes, barely visible in the gloom, showed no pity, only a kind of weary frustration. He had pulled a problem from the river, and now it was his. He bent down, not gently, and slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing to him. "You picked a hell of a day to drown," he muttered, and began to walk. He carried her away from the river, pushing through the drifts toward the timberline. She closed her eyes. The shaking was starting to subside, replaced by a heavy, dangerous lethargy. She buried her face against his chest, seeking warmth. He smelled of pine smoke, cured leather, and something metallic, like old blood. She did not care. He was solid ground in a world that had dissolved. The cabin was so small it seemed part of the wilderness, built of heavy, dark logs chinked with mud. It was little more than a hunter's lean-to, set back against a wall of rock to break the wind. Smoke plumed from a stone chimney, instantly torn apart by the storm. He kicked the door open with his boot and carried her inside. The change was immediate. The wind vanished, replaced by a thick, dry heat and a sudden, shocking silence. He did not set her down. He stood for a moment in the center of the single room, letting his eyes adjust, letting the warmth melt the ice from his beard. He looked like a man returning to a place he had forgotten, only to find a stranger there. He had been alone for a long time. Mara could feel it in the way he held her, a stiffness, an unfamiliarity with the weight of another person. He was wary, hesitant. This was his space, and she had invaded it. The cabin was sparse, brutally functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a black kettle hanging from a hook over the flames. A narrow cot was pushed against the far wall, covered in buffalo robes. Skinning knives and traps hung from wooden pegs. A saddle, worn and dark, sat on a stand in the corner. It was the den of a man who expected no one. Jed Callahan had not spoken a word to another human being in 46 days. The duel in Bozeman had cured him of company. He had killed a man, a loud, drunken man who pulled leather over a card game, and the look in the man's eyes as the life went out of him had followed Jed into the mountains. He had come here to let the silence and the cold scour him clean. He trapped, he hunted, and he waited for the part of him that felt human to finally die. And now this, a half-drowned woman in a wedding dress. The world he had tried to bolt shut had just washed up on his shore. He crossed the room and dumped her, unceremoniously, onto the braided rug in front of the hearth. Mara landed with a soft thump. For a moment, she just lay there, soaking wet, gratitude warring with a new, sharper fear. The river was death, but this cabin was an unknown. This man, he was an unknown. The fire was bliss. It was a living thing, and she crawled toward it, her hands outstretched. "Get those clothes off," he ordered. His voice, out of the wind, was quieter, but held the same rough edge. "You'll be dead in an hour if you don't." She looked up at him, her lips too numb to form words. He was peeling off his heavy fur coat, his movements economical. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and looked as hard as the mountains outside. A long, puckered scar ran from his temple down his jawline, disappearing into his beard. His eyes were the color of gunmetal, and they watched her with an unnerving stillness. She tried to unfasten her cloak, but her fingers were frozen claws. He sighed, a sound of profound impatience. He knelt, took a knife from his belt, and with one swift motion, slit the leather toggle on her cloak. He pulled the heavy, wet garment off her and tossed it steaming onto the hearthstones. Then he looked at the dress. It was a ruin of white silk and mud. "All of it," he said, his voice flat. He turned his back to her, a gesture that might have been courtesy or simple disinterest. "There's a blanket on the cot. Use it." Mara's body shook, not just from cold, but from humiliation. She was trapped. She had fled one man only to be cornered by another, but the cold was her master now. It demanded obedience. With fumbling, agonizing slowness, she unhooked the tiny buttons down her back, her fingers burning as the blood returned. The pain was excruciating, needles of fire stabbing into her hands and feet. She pulled the wet silk down, letting it pool at her waist, her chemise clinging to her like a second skin. She could not stop shaking. She looked at his back. He was tending to the fire, adding a log, his movement steady. He did not look at her. Working quickly. She shimmied out of the rest of the dress and the wet underthings, kicking the sodden pile away. Naked and trembling in the firelight, she grabbed the heavy woolen blanket from his cot and wrapped it tight around her body. It was rough and smelled of him, smoke and cold air. I'm done, she whispered. He turned, his face unreadable. He picked up the tin coffee pot from the coals and poured a steaming black liquid into a matching tin cup. He handed it to her. She took it with both hands, the heat a sudden, sharp blessing. She drank, scalding her throat. But the liquid was life. It was bitter and strong, and it lit a fire deep in her belly. "Thank you," she managed. Her lips were blue. He nodded, saying nothing. He moved to the other side of the fire, sitting on a low stool, and began the meticulous process of cleaning his rifle, laying the pieces out on a scrap of oilcloth. He was pointedly ignoring her, giving her space. Mara huddled in the blanket, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The cabin was warm. The storm was a muffled howl outside the thick logs. She watched him. He moved with a quiet competence, his hands sure and steady. There was a loneliness in his posture, in the way he bent over his work. That resonated with her own. This was not a cruel man, she thought, not like the man she had run from. This was just a man who was done. Her left hand, wrapped in the blanket, began to ache with a thaw. She looked down and saw the glimmer of gold, her wedding ring. A cold panic, sharper than the river, seized her. It was a brand. It marked her as property. She instinctively clenched her fist, hiding the ring in her palm. She saw him glance at the sudden movement. His eyes dropped to her hand, then back to his rifle. He had seen it, or seen the motion. He said nothing. He did not pry. In the West, you did not ask a person their name, and you did not ask where they came from. To ask was to invite lies or trouble. He was abiding by the code. "You're running," he stated. It was not a question. Mara flinched. She pulled the blanket tighter. "Yes." "From who?" From a man. Husband." She hesitated. The word tasted like ash. "Yes." He nodded again, as if this confirmed something he already knew. He snapped the rifle back together with a clean, metallic click. "He'll come looking." "Yes. This is the only cabin in this valley. If he's got trackers, he'll find his way here." Terror spiked in her chest. She had not thought beyond the river, beyond the cold. "I cannot go back. I will not." Jed looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw the desperation in her eyes, the bruise high on her cheekbone that was only now darkening as the blood returned to her face. He saw the terror that was older than the storm. He had seen that look before, on the faces of hunted animals just before the trap snapped shut. "I am just running from something," she whispered, as if to herself. "I just wanted to be gone." He stood up, the rifle in his hand, and walked to the single, small window, scraping the frost away with his thumb. He stared out into the blinding white. The storm had worsened. The wind howled, a high, thin shriek that sounded almost human. The cabin shuddered slightly as a gust hit it broadside. "You are not going anywhere tonight," he said. "No one is, not in this." Night fell. Not slowly, but like a hammer blow. The world outside the small window turned from gray to a deep, impenetrable black, alive with screaming wind and driven snow. The cabin, which had seemed a refuge, now felt like a cage. The tension in the small room grew thick. It was in the silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. It was in the awareness of their bodies. He was a large man. The room seemed to shrunk around him. She was a woman, wrapped only in his blanket. He made a simple, grim meal of jerky and hardtack, softened in hot water. He offered her a bowl. She ate, though she tasted nothing. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, two strangers bound by a blizzard. The hours passed. The fire burned lower. The exhaustion she had held at bay began to claim her. Her eyelids grew heavy, but sleep was impossible. To sleep was to be vulnerable. Jed rose from his stool and crossed to the cot. He pulled the heavy buffalo robes off it and tossed them onto the floor near the hearth, close to her. "Take the bed," he said.
"No,"
she said, her voice shaking.
I cannot. The floor is fine."
"It's the warmest place. Take it. I will sit."
"No."
She looked at the cot, then at him.
"I will not take your bed."
He stared at her for a long moment, his scarred face impassive in the flickering light. He seemed to be weighing options. Finally, he nodded, accepting her refusal. He sat back down in his chair, leaning it against the wall. He laid the rifle across his lap. He was going to watch her. The silence stretched again. The wind clawed at the roof. Mara lay down on the buffalo robes, curling into a tight ball, her back to him, but she could not relax. Every time the wind hit the cabin, every time a log popped in the fire, she flinched. She was listening to his breathing, tracking his smallest movements. He was a killer. The town gossip had been clear on that. Jed Callahan killed a man over cards, a dangerous man, a man who lived alone in the mountains like a wolf. And she was alone with him. She began to tremble again, but it was not from the cold. It was the dark. It was the memories of the last 2 days, the cold voice of her new husband, the way he looked at her, the feel of his hand on her arm. She had run from that, run into a blizzard, run into a river, only to be trapped here. The wind hit the door with a sound like a fist. Mara sat bolt upright, a small, choked cry escaping her. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the door, expecting it to burst open. Jed's head snapped up. He had not been asleep. His hand was tight on the rifle. "It's the wind," he said. "Just the wind."
"He will find me,"
she whispered. She was rocking slightly. The blanket clutched to her chest.
"He will drag me back."
"Not tonight, he won't. You do not know him." The terror was making her voice thin.
"He will. Please."
She looked at him, her defenses shattered by the cold and the fear.
"Please, do not leave me alone. Not tonight."
Her plea hung in the air, raw and desperate. She was not asking for comfort. She was not asking for protection. She was simply terrified of being alone in the dark, trapped with her own thoughts, waiting for the door to break open. Jed looked at her. He saw her terror, and perhaps he recognized it. It was the same terror he lived with, the fear of the past breaking into the present. He did not speak. He stood, his large frame blocking the firelight. He walked to the heavy plank door. He did not open it. He lifted the thick wooden bar from its brackets and slid it into place across the door frame. The sound was a heavy, definitive thud. It was the sound of a trap being set, or a sanctuary being sealed. Mara watched him, her breathing shallow. He had locked them in. He had locked the storm out. He had locked her in. The tension in the room pulled taut, a wire vibrating between them. He turned back, his face a mask of shadows. He walked past her and resumed his seat in the chair, the rifle resting again across his knees. He settled in, his eyes on the fire. The night ended in that silence. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and in the small, locked cabin, 2 broken souls kept watch, waiting for the dawn, both of them afraid to sleep. The light that woke Mara was not the sun. It was a cold, blue-gray glow that pressed against the cabin's single frosted window. The world had gone silent. The wind, which had screamed all night, had quieted to a low, mournful sigh. She was stiff, her bones aching from the cold floor and the tension of the night. She was still wrapped in the blanket, tucked into the buffalo robes near the hearth. The fire had burned down to a deep bed of glowing orange coals. Across the small room, Jed was exactly as he had been when she finally drifted into an exhausted, shallow sleep. He was sitting upright in the hardwood chair, tilted back against the log wall. The rifle was still balanced across his lap. His hat was tipped low, hiding his eyes. But she knew he was not sleeping. He was just waiting. The stillness in him was absolute, like a boulder settled at the bottom of a river. The sight of the heavy wooden bar still locked across the door sent a tremor through her. It had been an act of protection, she told herself. He had locked the storm out, but the finality of it, the thickness of the wood, made her stomach clench. She moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. Her bare feet touched the cold plank floor, and she hissed, pulling them back. Her own clothes, the ruined wedding dress and her cloak, were still in a sodden pile near the hearth. They were frozen stiff, useless. Jed's head lifted. He did not seem startled, just aware. He pushed his hat back, and his gray eyes settled on her. They held no warmth, but no malice either. They were just watchful.
"The fire,"
she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He nodded. He stood, unfolding his tall frame from the chair, and moved to the door. He lifted the heavy bar, the sound of the wood sliding in the brackets echoing in the small space. He set the bar on the floor and pulled the door open. Mara braced for the wind, but none came. Instead, the cold, still air hit her, and the new light flooded the cabin. She stepped up behind him, peering around his broad shoulder, and her breath caught. The world was gone. There was no valley, no timberline, no mountains. There was only white. The snow had drifted higher than the cabin's small porch, creating a smooth, sculpted landscape. The sky was a pale, flat white, indistinguishable from the ground. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. They were buried. "It stopped," Jed said. His voice was rough from the night. "We are trapped." Aye. He looked up, scanning the seamless white. "For a time, it will crust over. But not today. No one's traveling in this. Not in, not out." He turned from the door, grabbing his heavy fur coat from a peg. He pulled on his boots, his movements economical, and picked up a large wooden bucket. He left the cabin, stepping into the drift up to his waist, moving toward the line of trees to find the creek for water, or perhaps to check his traps. Mara watched him go, a dark figure shrinking against the vast, impossible white. Then she turned back to the room, to the dying coals. A strange rhythm began. It was not comfortable, and it was not chosen. It was the rhythm of survival. She found the kindling he kept in a dry box by the hearth and carefully, her fingers still tender and stiff, rebuilt the fire. She found the coffee pot, dumped the old grounds outside the door, and looked for fresh water. There was none. She was forced to wait for his return, feeling useless. He came back 20 minutes later, his beard thick with ice, the bucket full of dark, cold water. He set it down without a word. She took the dipper, filled the coffee pot, and set it on the hook over the new flames. While the water heated, Jed sat on his stool and picked up a metal contraption of springs and teeth, a beaver trap. One of the springs was bent. He took a small hammer and a pair of pliers. He was lost in the work, his hands, rough and scarred, moving with a surprising precision. He tapped at the metal, his brow furrowed, testing the mechanism again and again. Mara stayed by the fire. Her task? She was the keeper of the warmth. It felt like the only thing she could do. She found a worn shirt of his, tossed over a pack, and put it on. It hung to her knees, the wool scratching her skin, but it was dry. She rolled the sleeves up, exposing her forearms. She knelt, stirring the fire with a poker, and the heat bathed her face. As she pushed a log into place, the firelight caught the skin on her left wrist. Jed stopped hammering. The tink, tink, tink was replaced by the cabin's silence. He was looking at her. Not at her face. He was looking at her wrist. She instinctively pulled the sleeve down, but it was too late. He had seen. The scars were old, but they were stark white against her skin, which was red from the returning blood. They were thin, pale lines, parallel to each other, wrapping around her wrist like a forgotten bracelet. Rope burns, healed over years. She looked at him, defiant and ashamed. He said nothing. His eyes lifted from her wrist to her face, held her gaze for a single, unreadable moment, and then returned to the trap. The hammering began again. Tink, tink, tink. He did not ask, he did not judge, he just worked. Later, as he was putting the trap aside, he stood to stretch, his back stiff from the chair and the cold. He reached one arm high above his head, pulling the rough-spun cotton of his shirt taut against his body. Mara saw it then. She had been staring into the fire, but her eyes were drawn to the movement. On his right side, just below his arm, the shirt strained against a ridge of flesh that should not have been there. It was a scar, thick and puckered, the color of old wax. It ran along his ribs, a crooked line where a bullet had gouged him and the flesh had healed badly, pulling tight. She looked away instantly, feeling as though she had read a page from a private diary. He had seen her cage. She had seen his... The silence that followed was different. It was heavier, freighted with the things they now knew about each other without a single word being spoken. He broke it, his voice low. "There's oats in the sack by the door, and salt." She nodded, grateful for the task. She mixed the oatmeal with water in a small pot and cooked it over the fire. A gray, bland mush. It was food. It was hot. They ate sitting on opposite sides of the hearth, the tin bowls warm in their hands. She ate quickly, staring into the flames. The silence was pressing on her. And the food, the shared warmth, made her feel a sudden, desperate need to justify her presence, to explain the trouble she had brought to his door. "He is a rancher," she said, her voice quiet. Jed did not look up from his bowl. He only grunted, a small sound to show he was listening. "Silas Croft, near Helena, my father. My father owed him a great deal of money, debts from the mines." She stopped, the spoon shaking in her hand. "I was part of the payment. I am 19. Jed looked up. His eyes were hard, but the hardness was not directed at her. "He is..." She searched for the word. "He is an old man, older than my father. He has buried 2 wives already." She looked down at her hands, at the pale skin where her ring used to be. She had pulled it from her finger in the night and dropped it into the coals, watching the gold blacken and disappear. "He is not a kind man. He believes a thing purchased belongs to him, to do with as he pleases." She did not need to say more. The air in the cabin was thick with the implication. The bruises on her face, the old scars on her wrists, the terror that had driven her into a blizzard. It all formed a picture. Jed set his empty bowl on the floor. He stared at the fire, his jaw working under his beard. The scar along his temple seemed to pull tighter. He looked like a man listening to a story he already knew by heart. He did not speak of himself. He offered no name of his own, no tale of the scar on his ribs or the duel that had marked him. He simply accepted her truth, absorbing it into his own vast, cold silence. The pain in his stillness was its own confession. He understood cruelty. He understood why a person would run. He rose, pulled on his coat, and picked up his rifle. "I'm going to clear the roof and check the snares. Do not unbar the door." He left her alone, but the cabin felt different. It was no longer the den of a stranger. It was just a small room holding 2 people. The next day, the snow fell again. Soft, thick flakes that piled another foot against the window. The world was sealed shut. The days began to blur, marked only by the shifting light and the demands of survival. A new rhythm found them. It was a quiet companionship born of necessity. Small gestures replaced speech. When he came in from the cold, his beard stiff with ice, she would have hot coffee waiting. When the firewood ran low, he would wordlessly hand her the small axe to split the kindling while he took the larger one outside to battle the drifts. On the third day, the sky cleared to a brilliant, blinding blue. The world outside was painfully bright. "You need to learn," he said. He took his rifle from the pegs. He handed it to her. It was heavier than she could have imagined, the wood smooth, the metal cold. I have never held one." "It's time you did. Out here. There is no one to protect you. Only this." He took her outside, into the blue-white glare. He made her stand in the deep snow, showing her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. His presence was overwhelming. He stood behind her, his body close but not touching, his voice a low rumble by her ear. "Squeeze, do not pull." His hand, calloused and hard, settled over hers, adjusting her grip on the trigger. A shock went through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the first human touch she had felt in, she could not remember how long. That was not meant to harm. She flinched, pulling away slightly. He stepped back immediately, his face impassive. Again. She fired. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming the rifle butt into her shoulder so hard it sent her stumbling back. The shot went wide, kicking up snow 10 feet from the pine cone he had set on a stump. "Again," he said, his voice flat. She fired again and again. He made her reload, his hands guiding her clumsy fingers, forcing the heavy cartridges into the chamber. He was patient, relentlessly so. He was not teaching her to be a hunter. He was teaching her to be a weapon. By the time they went back inside, her shoulder was a deep, throbbing ache, but she had hit the pine cone twice. That evening, while he skinned the 2 rabbits he had pulled from his snares, Mara sat by the fire. She picked up his work shirt, the one with the bullet hole in the side. She found his mending kit in his pack, a small roll of leather holding a few needles and thick, coarse thread. Her hands were more suited to this. She stitched the hole, her movements small and neat. The wool was rough, but she worked carefully, pulling the fabric together, closing the gap. It was a small, quiet act. She was mending his shirt. She was mending the hole in his armor. She was still sewing when he finished his work. He washed the blood from his hands in a basin of snowmelt, his back to her. She saw the muscles in his back and shoulders move under his shirt. He was a man made of hard lines and quiet strength. The attraction was no longer something she could ignore. It was a physical thing, a warmth in the center of the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire. It was in the way her eyes followed him, the way she was hyper-aware of his proximity. The cabin was too small. He filled it, his scent of pine and smoke and cold air a constant presence. She saw him watch her, too, when she bent to the fire, her borrowed shirt riding up, or when she brushed her hair back from her face, a long, dark strand catching the light. His gaze would linger for a half-second too long, a flicker of heat in his gray eyes, before he would look away, his jaw tightening. They were orbiting each other, 2 planets held in check by a force they both refused to name. He was a man bound by the guilt of his past. She was a woman who still belonged, by law and by God, to another. The air crackled with the restraint. On the 5th night, the nightmares came for her. She was running, not in the snow, but down the dark, polished hallway of Silas Croft's new, empty house. The carpets were thick, muffling her steps. She was in her wedding dress, but it was heavy, soaked in river water. She heard him calling her name. "Mara, Mara, it is your duty." His voice was not loud. It was soft, reasonable. That was the worst part. He was a man of absolute control. He never yelled. He simply stated what was his and what he would do. She reached the end of the hall, and the door was locked. She clawed at it, her nails breaking. And then she felt his hand on her shoulder. It was not rough. It was heavy, possessive, the touch of a man branding cattle. She woke with a choked scream, sitting bolt upright on the cot. She had taken the bed the last 2 nights, after he had insisted, his patience worn thin by her refusals. He slept on the robes by the fire. He was on his feet before her scream faded, the rifle in his hands, moving from sleep to lethal alertness in a single heartbeat. He crossed the room in 2 strides. "What?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the dark corners. The barred door.
No,
She gasped, her hands flying to her face. She was trembling, the phantom touch still burning on her shoulder.
a dream. It was just a dream.
He stopped, his body tense, caught between violence and concern. He lowered the rifle. He looked at her, huddled on the cot, shaking so hard the frame rattled. He did not leave. He did not go back to the fire. He stood there, watching her tremble, his face a mask of frustration and some deeper, softer emotion he fought to hide. He cursed, a low, rough sound. He sat on the edge of the cot, the rifle resting by his feet. He did not touch her. "You are safe here," he said. It sounded like an order. "He will find me." She wept, the tears coming hot and fast. "He will find me and he will drag me back." "No," Jed said. "You do not know him. He owns everything. He owns the law. He owns me." The last word was a whisper of ultimate despair. Jed's hand moved, hesitant. It was the slow, wary movement of a man approaching a spooked horse. He put his hand on her shoulder, the same shoulder she had felt in the dream. His touch was nothing like the dream. It was rough, his palm calloused, but it was steady. It was a lifeline. She collapsed, leaning into him, burying her face in the rough wool of his shirt. The sobs came then, all the terror and exhaustion of the last week, of the last month, breaking free. She clung to him, her fingers gripping his shirt. He was stiff, unmoving. He had not held another person in years. He had forgotten how, but as she trembled, his other arm came up, circling her, pulling her close against his chest. He held her. He just held her. One hand spread wide against her back, the other tangled in her hair, while she cried herself out. He said nothing. He just absorbed the storm of her grief. The silence that followed her weeping was more intimate than any conversation. Her trembling subsided. She was tucked against his side, his chin resting on the top of her head. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her ear. She shifted, lifting her head to look at him. Her face was only inches from his. In the low glow of the coals, his eyes were no longer gray and hard. They were dark, deep, and full of a profound, aching loneliness that matched her own. His gaze dropped to her mouth. She saw the change in him. The stillness of his body became a different kind of tension. It was the stillness of a man holding his breath. He leaned in. She did not pull away. She rose up slightly, meeting him. Their breath mingled. She could smell the smoke on him, and the cold night air. This was it, the breaking point, the moment the restraint snapped. His lips were almost on hers, a breath away, when he suddenly froze. His entire body went rigid. A look of sharp, sudden guilt, a pain so deep it was almost physical, crossed his features. He was looking at her, but he was seeing something else. He was seeing a ring on her finger. He was seeing a man he had killed. He was seeing the wreckage he caused. He pulled away from her, not gently. He stood up abruptly, moving so fast he almost knocked the cot over. He grabbed his rifle and stalked to the door, his back to her.
"Jed,"
she whispered, her voice broken. He didn't answer. He ripped the bar from the door, shoved it open, and stepped out onto the snow. He left the door wide open. The frozen air flooded the cabin. A sudden, brutal shock. It extinguished the warmth they had shared, snuffing it out like a candle. Mara sat on the cot, shivering, pulling the blanket around her. She watched his silhouette against the snow-lit darkness. Jed stood outside, his head bowed, the rifle hanging loose in his hand. The night air was like knives in his lungs, but he welcomed it. He needed the pain. He needed the cold to clear his head. He had almost done it. He had almost taken the one thing she had left, her choice. He had almost become the man she was running from, taking what he wanted in a moment of weakness. She was another man's wife, a brand on her soul, a law he could not ignore. To touch her was to poison her. To save her, he had to stay a killer, a protector, not a lover. He looked up at the black, frozen peaks, his breath steaming in the dark. "I cannot save her," he whispered to the unforgiving mountains. "Not like this." The silence that followed Jed's retreat into the storm was sharper than the cold he let in. He had returned, eventually, his beard crusted with new ice, the shoulders of his coat white. He did not look at Mara. He simply barred the door, kicked the snow from his boots, and added logs to the fire. She had pretended to be asleep, her back to him, her body rigid under the blanket. The air in the cabin was thick with the unsaid, with the ghost of a kiss that had almost been. Morning came, and with it, a tacit agreement. They would not speak of it. The wall of his restraint was back, higher and colder than before. But something had shifted. The cabin, which had been his prison, was now their shared confinement, and the days, which had been a marker of his solitude, now became a measure of their forced intimacy. A week passed. The snow did not stop. It paused. It softened. It swirled. But it did not end. It piled in great sculpted drifts against the north wall, burying the window until Jed had to dig it out with a shovel just to let in the light. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the metallic tink-tink of Jed mending his traps, and the constant, weary sigh of the wind. Their supplies dwindled with alarming speed. The oat sack, once plump, now lay limp and dusty against the wall. They were down to the scrapings. The last of the jerky was eaten. The small sack of beans reduced to a handful. Jed's snares, set near the creek line, came up empty day after day. The deep snow and relentless cold had driven the animals to ground. They survived on thin oatmeal gruel, boiled rabbit, and weak, bitter coffee. The grounds reused until they were just brown water. The hunger hollowed them out, scraping their nerves raw. And the tension, the fragile magnetic thing that lived between them, simmered. It was a strange, silent dance. They moved around each other in the small space with a careful, practiced grace. When she reached for the kettle, he was already moving away from the hearth. When he crossed to the door, she instinctively shifted to the cot. They were two poles of a magnet, desperate to connect, yet forced by their natures to repel. His guilt was a physical presence in the room. It was in the tightness of his jaw, the way he never let his eyes rest on her for more than a second. He was punishing himself, and her for the moment of weakness on the cot. But for Mara, that moment had been a revelation. He had pulled away. He had stopped. In that single act of restraint, he had proven he was nothing like Silas Croft. Silas took this man, this scarred, silent killer, held back. The fear she had carried, the knot of terror that had lived in her belly since she fled, began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, unwind. She was trapped. Yes, she was hungry. Yes, but she was not prey. On the 8th day, the sun broke through. It was a sudden, violent arrival, a flood of light that poured through the newly cleared window. The cabin was lit not just by the fire, but by a brilliant, dazzling white that reflected off the endless snowfields. Mara, who had been listlessly stirring their meager breakfast, went to the window. The frost on the inside of the glass was thick, a fern-like tracery of ice. She put her hand against it. the cold stinging her palm. Using her fingernail, she began to scrape a small peephole in the ice. The world outside was bright, sterile, and still, but as she watched, a tiny, impossible thing happened. A snowbird, a small, dark speck of life, landed on the drift just outside the window. It hopped twice, its head cocked, a defiant survivor in the white desert. Mara stared at it. A sound bubbled up in her chest. It was a rusty, foreign sound, half choked. It was a laugh. It was not loud. It was barely more than a breath. But in the tomb-like silence of the cabin, it was a thunderclap. Jed, who was oiling his rifle by the fire, froze, his hands stilled on the cloth. He turned his head slowly, looking at her. He had not heard that sound in this room. He had not heard it in himself for years. It was the sound of life, fragile and insistent, and it struck him with the force of a blow. He watched her, her face pressed to the glass, her shoulders shaking with that quiet, broken laugh. He watched the way the sunlight caught the dark strands of her hair, and he felt the emptiness of the cabin, the barren solitude he had built around himself. Crack. She was not just a person he had rescued. She was light. She was warmth. And her presence was softening the hard, frozen ground of his guilt. She felt his eyes on her and turned, her smile fading, her cheeks flushing. It was just a bird. He nodded, saying nothing, and turned back to his rifle. But the air had changed. The sound of her laugh lingered. That evening, the quiet was different. It was no longer strained. It was contemplative. They ate their thin soup, the silence stretching. It was Jed who finally broke it. "The scar," he said, his voice low and rough, not looking at her. "The one on my ribs. You saw it." Mara looked up from her bowl. "Yes." He set his bowl aside. He stared into the fire, his hands clasped between his knees. He looked like a man about to lift something impossibly heavy. "It was 3 years ago, in Bozeman." He paused, gathering the words. "I had a brother, Abel. He was younger, full of wind and vinegar, and not half as smart as he thought." He traced a line on the dusty floor with the heel of his boot. He fell in with a man named Elias Thorne, a man who owned a saloon and most of the men who drank in it. Thorne was a cheat, but he was clever. He was bleeding Abel dry at the card table, night after night. Jed's voice was flat, a recitation of facts. "I told Abel to stay away. He would not listen. He thought he could win it back. One night, I followed him. I stood in the back of the saloon. I watched Thorne deal from the bottom of the deck. Abel lost everything. The horse, the saddle, the $50 our father had left him. He stood up, drunk and mad, and he called Thorne out." He stopped. The fire popped, a log settling, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Thorne laughed. Jed continued, his voice hardening. "He had 2 men with him. They were moving to grab Abel, to haul him out, maybe beat him. Abel reached for his gun. He was just a boy. He would have been dead before his hand cleared the leather. So I stepped in." He did not have to say the next part. Mara could see it, the crowded, smoky room, the smell of whiskey and fear. "It was not a duel," Jed said, his voice barely a whisper. "Everyone said it was a fair fight. The marshal called it, but it was not. Thorne was drunk. He was clumsy. I was not. He pulled his gun, and I shot him. He fired. The bullet hit me in the ribs." He touched his side. "But mine hit him in the chest. I killed him right there on the saloon floor, in front of my brother." He finally looked at her. His eyes were hollow, filled with a guilt so profound it looked like a physical sickness. "I did it to protect him, to save him from his own foolishness." "You did save him," Mara whispered. "No." His voice was bitter. "I did not. I destroyed him. He looked at me, not with gratitude. He looked at me like I was a monster, like I was something he had never seen before. He saw what I was capable of." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness. He left town 2 days later, rode south. I have not seen him since. The guilt, the look on his face. It did not just drive me into solitude. It is my solitude. I am a killer. Mara. Not for money, not for rage, but for a reason that did not even matter in the end. It cost me everything. The cabin was silent. Mara sat, absorbing his confession. She thought of the law, of the men who used it like a club. She thought of Silas, whose violence was casual, sanctioned by a piece of paper that called her his wife. She stood and walked to stand beside him. He did not look at her, but she could feel him brace, expecting pity or judgment. She did not flinch. "You killed one man to save your brother," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Silas, he has destroyed 3 women, and he did it just because he could, because the law gave him leave, because he was bored. That is not the same." He turned, his face shadowed, his eyes searching hers. "I understand," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I understand what it means to be desperate, to do a thing you thought you could never do, just to breathe. My desperation was running. Yours was not." His expression crumpled. The hard, iron mask he wore, the one that kept the world out, dissolved. He saw no fear in her eyes. He saw no judgment. He saw himself. The walls that had stood between them, built of his guilt and her fear, crumbled to dust. That night, the storm returned with a new fury. The wind, which had only sighed, now screamed. It hit the cabin like a solid object, making the log walls groan. Snow and ice lashed against the small window, the sound like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. Mara lay on the cot, but sleep was impossible. The cabin felt like a ship in a storm, and the man across the room was the epicenter of it. She heard him move. He was not on the robes by the fire. She sat up, in the dim, flickering light of the low fire. She saw him. He was sitting on the stool, his forearms braced on his knees, his head hanging down. He was dressed, as if he had never intended to sleep. And his hands, which she had only ever seen as steady, on the rifle, on the traps, on her shoulder, were shaking. She slipped off the cot, her bare feet silent on the plank floor. She padded across the cold room and knelt on the rug beside him. "Jed?" He started, his head snapping up. His face was pale, slick with a cold sweat. His eyes were wide, staring at something that was not her. "A dream," he muttered. He tried to clench his hands to stop the trembling, hiding them between his knees. He was ashamed of the confession, ashamed of this weakness. "The wind is loud," she said, offering him an excuse. He just shook his head, looking away. She did not retreat. She sat beside him, on the floor, close enough that her shoulder brushed his knee. She looked into the fire, giving him the dignity of not being watched. "I am not afraid of you, Jed," she whispered, the words almost lost in the howl of the wind. He turned his head, looking down at her. "You should be." "No." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I told you, I know what desperation is. I am not afraid of that." She lifted her hand. It was a slow, hesitant motion, just as his had been when he touched her shoulder. She did not touch his shaking hands. She reached for his face. Her fingers, calloused now from the firewood and the mending, traced the long, puckered scar that ran from his temple down his jaw. It was a map of his pain. He flinched, but he did not pull away. He closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. Her touch was impossibly gentle. It was not pity. It was acceptance. "You are not a monster," she whispered. He opened his eyes. They were dark, filled with the firelight and a raw, unguarded hunger. He had been starving for longer than a week. She leaned in. He watched her come. This time, there was no surprise. This time, there was no nightmare. This time, he was awake. He was letting it happen. He was making a choice. When her lips touched his, it was a question. His answer was a low sound in his chest, a groan of surrender. He did not kiss her back, not at first. He just let her. He let her be the strong one. He let her be the one to cross the line. The kiss was trembling, hesitant, and achingly slow. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It tasted of smoke and the metallic tang of fear and the salt of his sweat. It was the first kind touch, the first truly chosen touch either of them had known in a very long time. It lasted only a moment, but it broke him. He pulled back, pushing her away, but gently this time. He stood, moving to the hearth, putting the fire between them. He was shaking again, but for a different reason. "Mara," he whispered, his voice thick. He could not look at her. He stared at the flames. You cannot, you deserve more than this, more than a man like me, a killer, a man hiding in a hole." She stood up slowly, her whole body humming from the contact. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The girl who had fallen in the river was not the woman standing in the cabin now. "More?" she said, her voice low and fierce. "What do I deserve? Jed? A man who bought me like a broodmare? A man who would hunt me down with dogs and drag me back on a rope?" He flinched, turning to face her. "You decide what you deserve," she said, taking a step toward him. "You let your guilt be your jailer, but do not you decide what I deserve." She stood before him, defiant and strong. "You are the man who pulled me from the river. You are the man who taught me to shoot. You are the man who held me when I woke shaking. I am not afraid of you, and I am not afraid of this." The air between them was electric. The argument hung there, unresolved. They both knew a line had been crossed, a seal broken. Their desire, now spoken, now acted upon, was inescapable. The moment was shattered by a sound from outside. It was not the wind. It was the sharp crack of a frozen branch snapping under a heavy weight. Jed's head snapped toward the door. He was in hunter mode instantly. The trembling gone. His body coiled. He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "What was it?" Mara whispered. "Get away from the window." He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The wind howled, covering any other sound. He waited. Nothing. He stood there for a long minute, listening, his body a wire pulled taut. "Maybe it was just the snow," she offered. He shook his head. "No." He unbarred the door, just an inch, peering out into the swirling darkness. He saw nothing. He closed it, rebarring it. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice grim. "When the light comes." He did not go back to his chair. He did not go to the floor. He stood by the door, the rifle in his hand, and he watched the night. When morning finally broke, gray and cold, Jed was outside before Mara had even stirred. He moved in a low crouch, circling the cabin, his rifle ready. He found them on the ridge, 50 yards from the cabin. Tracks. They were partially filled with the night's new snow, but they were unmistakably clear. Not wolf, not deer. Shod horses. 3 of them. They had come up the valley, circled the cabin from the high ground, close enough to see the smoke from the chimney. Then they had retreated, back down toward the timber line. They knew someone was here. They were just waiting for the storm to break. Jed ran back to the cabin, kicking the door open, snow flying. Mara was on her feet, her eyes wide. The tenderness of the night, the confession, the hesitant kiss, it all evaporated like mist. He looked at her, his face carved from ice, the old hard emptiness back in his eyes. "They have found us." The words hit the small cabin like stones. "They have found us." Mara, who had been standing by the fire, a fragile truce settling in her heart, felt the cold return. It was not the cold of the snow, but the cold of the river, the cold of fear. Jed stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, the rifle held loose in his hand. The man who had kissed her last night, the man whose confession still hung in the air, was gone. This was the hunter. This was the killer. "You are certain?" she whispered. 3 riders, shod horses. They came up the ridge, just before the light. They were smart. They did not come close. They saw the smoke. He kicked the door shut and barred it. The heavy thud no longer a sound of safety, but of a cage door closing. "They will be waiting," he said, his voice flat. He moved to the pegs, checking his gear. "They know we are trapped. They will wait for the storm to break, and then they will come." He began to move with a grim, economical purpose. He checked the leather straps on his snowshoes. He pulled his one remaining pack from under the cot and began filling it with the last of their food. A handful of oats, the frozen meat from the rabbits, a small pouch of salt. What is the plan?" Mara asked, her voice shaking. Jed did not look at her. He was checking the action on his rifle, his hands sure and steady. The tremor from the night before burned away by the new, cold certainty. "I have 1 horse," he said, his voice low. "A mountain cayuse, in the lean-to, tough, used to the cold. When the snow eases, just enough to ride, you will take him." Mara's blood ran cold. You mean we will take him?" "No." He snapped the rifle's chamber shut. You will ride south, toward the pass. Follow the creek bed. It will be hard, but the horse can make it. Do not stop. Do not light a fire unless you are a day's ride from here." She stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders. "And you?" "I will stay." To what? To fight them? 3 men? "I will slow them down." He said. The words were a lie, and they both knew it. He meant to be the bait. He meant to die here, in the cold, to buy her a few hours. The fear in her vanished, replaced by a sudden, hot anger. "No!" He turned, his face hard. "This is not a discussion, Mara." "No," she said again, her voice rising. She crossed the small room and stood before him. "I will not run. I will not leave you here to be your sacrifice. I am not your brother, Jed. You do not get to save me and destroy yourself." "You do not understand," he hissed, his frustration breaking through. "These are not ranchers. They are trackers, hired guns. This is what they do. They will not stop. They will hunt you until you fall. And when they catch you, they will drag you back to that man. I will not let that happen." "And I will not let this happen," she cried, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You are not a man. You are a ghost. You have been hiding in these mountains, punishing yourself for a duel you won. You are so wrapped up in your guilt that you would rather die here, fulfilling your own prophecy, than live." The word struck him harder than a bullet. He recoiled, his face paling. "You are hiding," she pressed, the words tumbling out, hot and desperate. "You hide behind that duel. You hide behind your brother's memory. You think you are noble, but you are a coward. You are so terrified of loving someone, of letting them in, that you would rather push me out into a blizzard alone, just so you can keep your precious guilt intact." He grabbed her arms, his fingers digging in. "That is enough." "No, it is not." She fought against his grip, her eyes blazing into his. "I risked everything to be free. I rode into a storm. I almost drowned. I will not be turned away by a man who is too afraid to try." His face was inches from hers, his breath coming hard. He was torn, the killer and the man warring behind his eyes. "I am terrified," he whispered. The words ripped from his throat. The admission shattered his anger, leaving only the raw, exposed wound. "Do you not see? I am terrified of this. I am terrified of loving again. I loved my brother, Mara, and my violence. The very thing I used to protect him was the thing that drove him away. He looked at me like I was a monster. He let go of her, turning away. His hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. If I let myself care for you, and those men come, I will do what I have to do. I will kill them. And you will see me. You will see what I am. And you will look at me just like he did. He sank onto the stool, his head in his hands. I will not be the reason your life is destroyed. I will not be the monster you see before you die. It is better this way. The cabin was silent, save for his ragged breathing and the howl of the wind. Mara looked at him, at his broad shoulders shaking, not with cold, but with a grief so deep it had defined his life. Her anger dissolved, replaced by a vast, aching tenderness. He had laid his broken soul at her feet. She knelt before him, just as she had the night before, but this time there was no hesitation. She took his clenched fists in her hands, her fingers gently uncurved reading them, lacing her own through his. His hands were ice cold. You are right, she said, her voice soft. He looked up, his eyes filled with a weary confusion. You are terrified, she continued, her grip tightening on his. So am I. I am terrified of Silas. I am terrified of those men. I am terrified of this snow and this hunger. She leaned closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. But the only thing in this world I am not afraid of is you, Jed Callahan. He stared at her, his throat working. I have seen what you are, she whispered. You are the man who pulled me from the river. You are the man who taught me to use a rifle. You are the man who held me when I was screaming from nightmares. And you are the man who pulled away, when you could have not. She brought his hand to her cheek, pressing his rough knuckles against her skin. I do not see a monster. I see a man, and I will not leave him. The argument was over. The truth was laid bare. He did not pull his hand away. He just watched her, his defenses utterly gone, his heart exposed. Night fell. The storm raged outside, a symphony of violence and wind, but inside the cabin, a stillness had fallen. They had argued, they had confessed, and they were still here. They were still together. They ate the last of the food, a thin, watery gruel of oats and rabbit. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. The decision had been made. They would face what was coming in the morning, together. The fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows. Jed sat on the buffalo robes, his back against the wall, the rifle across his lap. He was keeping watch. Mara lay on the cot, but she did not sleep. She watched him. She watched the way the firelight caught the silver in his beard, the way his chest rose and fell in a steady, slow rhythm. The hours passed. The wind shrieked. Finally, she could not bear the distance. It felt suddenly like the last night they had. It felt like a waste. She rose from the cot, the blanket wrapped around her. She crossed the small, cold room and sat on the robes beside him. He looked at her, his eyes dark in the shadows. He did not tell her to go back to bed. She said nothing. She simply sat, her shoulder brushing his, and shared the watch. They stared into the dying coals. Two broken people, united in a fragile, desperate present. He was the first to move. He shifted, his arm moving from the rifle to settle around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. It was a simple, heavy gesture, an acceptance, a surrender. She leaned her head against his chest, sliding her arm around his waist, clinging to his warmth. He was solid. He was real. I am so cold, she whispered, though she was not. He adjusted his grip, pulling the heavy buffalo robe up to cover them both, creating a small, warm cave in the frozen world. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face was scarred. His eyes were haunted. But as he looked down at her, she saw only the man who was just as lost and just as desperate for warmth as she was. This time, when he leaned down, it was not hesitant. It was not a question. It was a choice. Their kiss was not like the first, hesitant touch. This was desperate, and it was deep. It was the kiss of two people who had nothing left to lose and had just admitted they had everything to gain. It was the taste of smoke and hunger and a raw, hopeless love. He laid her back on the robes, his body covering hers, shielding her from the cold floor and the howling wind. His hands were rough against her skin, but his touch was tender. He memorized the shape of her face with his fingers, as if seeing her for the first time. They came together not in a fury, but in a quiet, desperate need. It was tender. It was a desperate search for life in a world that had promised them only death. It was two souls clinging to each other in a frozen, indifferent wilderness, finding a heat that was all their own. There was no shame. There was no guilt. There was only the sound of the fire, the screaming wind, and the stubborn, defiant beat of two hearts that refused to be silent. They held each other through the night, a tangle of limbs under the heavy robes, finding a comfort that was almost painful in its intensity. For the first time since she had fled, Mara slept, a deep, dreamless sleep, her face buried in Jed's shoulder, his arms locked around her like a fortress. Morning came with a shock. Silence. The wind had stopped. Jed was awake instantly. He slid from her embrace, his movements fluid and quiet. He dressed in the frigid air, his breath pluming. Mara sat up, clutching the robe to her chest, the warmth of the night already a fading memory. The cabin was freezing.
Jed?
It stopped, he said, his voice grim. He pulled on his boots. The storm has cleared. He unbarred the door and opened it. The light that flooded the cabin was not the blue-gray of the storm. It was a brilliant, sharp yellow. The sun was out. The sky was a painfully clear blue. And their refuge, the little cabin, was now exposed, a dark speck against a pristine, blinding white landscape. A perfect target. He grabbed his rifle. "Stay here! Bar the door!" He was gone, wading through the chest-deep snow, moving toward the ridge. Mara did as he said, her heart hammering. She dressed quickly, pulling on the rough wool shirt, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. He was back in 10 minutes. His face was granite. He did not need to speak. She saw it in his eyes. "They are closer," she stated. "At the mouth of the valley," he confirmed. "Building a fire. They are just waiting for the crust to freeze hard enough to ride. They will be here by noon." The time for talking was over. The time for fighting was here. He moved to the lean-to and began saddling the cayuse. It was a small, tough-looking Mustang, its coat shaggy. He packed the saddlebags, his movements quick and precise. He brought the horse to the cabin door. He came back inside and handed her the rifle. "You know how to use it." "What about you?" He strapped his revolver to his hip and slid the long skinning knife into his belt. "I will manage." He was determined to lead them away. He was determined to fight. Mara looked at him, at the horse, at the blindingly beautiful, deadly day. A wave of despair washed over her. "What if there is no peace, Jed? What if we run and they just keep coming? What if we trade this cage for a bigger one?" Jed stopped, his hand on the saddle. He looked at her, and his face softened. "Then we will face that one, too, together. I am done hiding, Mara." His words settled her. She looked past him, into the cabin. Her eyes fell on the frozen, muddy pile of her past. The wedding dress. She walked to the hearth and picked it up. The silk was stiff as board, the lace torn. It was the symbol of her bondage. "We need a bigger fire," she said. Jed watched her. He did not question. He added 2 logs to the coals, and the flames leaped up. Mara held the dress for a long moment. She thought of Silas, of the parlor and Helena, of the girl she had been. Then, with a sudden, clean motion, she shoved the dress into the heart of the fire. The frozen silk hissed and sputtered. Then it caught. The delicate lace blackened. The seed pearls popping in the heat. A thick, acrid smoke filled the cabin. The smell of burning hope and a dead life. Ashes, black and gray, rose from the chimney, disappearing like ghosts into the bright blue sky. She turned to Jed. Her face was calm, resolute. "I am ready." He helped her onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his body a shield. He settled her in front of him, the rifle across her lap, his arms around her, one hand on the reins. "Hold tight," he said, his voice a low rumble by her ear. He kicked the horse, and it lunged, fighting the deep drift, moving toward the dark, sheltering line of the pines. They had to reach the timberline. They were halfway there, the horse snorting, its legs churning, when the first shot cracked through the silent morning. It did not sound like a gunshot. It was a sharp crack, like an ice-covered branch snapping. A puff of snow exploded a foot from the horse's head. "Down!" Jed roared, kicking the horse harder. 2 more shots rang out, closer this time, echoing off the canyon walls. They were coming from the ridge. The trackers were already in position. "Whine!" A bullet sang past Mara's ear. Jed twisted, shoving her down, her face pressed against the horse's mane. He leaned his own body over hers. They were almost to the trees. 10 more yards. A rifle cracked again, this time from a different spot. They were being flanked. Jed cried out, a sharp, choked grunt. "Jed!" she screamed, twisting to look at him. "I am fine," he yelled. "Hold on." But he was not fine. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his left shoulder, high near the arm. He had been grazed. He ignored it, his face a mask of grim determination. He spurred the horse into the trees, the low-hanging, snow-laden branches whipping their faces. The bullets stopped. The trees gave them cover. "Where are we going?" she yelled. "The canyon," he grunted, his breath coming hard. "They will not follow us easily in there." He drove the horse, not slowing, up a steep, rocky game trail. The animal slipped, regained its footing, and scrambled on. Behind them, they could hear the men shouting, but they did not follow immediately. They would have to circle. They rode for another 20 minutes, the only sound the horse's desperate breathing and the jingle of the harness. Jed was slumped, his weight heavy against her back. He pulled the horse to a stop under a deep rock overhang, a shallow cave set back into the canyon wall. It was barely a shelter, but it was out of the wind and hidden from the trail. He slid from the saddle, nearly falling. "Jed, you are hit," Mara said, jumping down. "It is nothing," he muttered, but he leaned heavily against the rock, his face pale. The snow, which had held off, began to fall again. Soft, silent flakes drifting down, already beginning to cover their tracks. The storm was their only friend. They were hidden. They were safe. For now. Mara turned to him in the deep shadow of the cave. The blood was a stark, bright red against the dark wool of his coat. "Sit," she commanded, her voice firm. He looked at her, surprised by her tone, but he obeyed, sliding down the rock wall. She ripped a long, clean strip from the hem of her chemise. Her hands were not shaking. She pulled open his coat, pushing the bloody fabric aside. The bullet had torn a nasty, shallow groove across the top of his shoulder. It was bleeding badly. She pressed the cloth to the wound. Hard. He hissed, his eyes squeezing shut. "Hold this," she ordered. He pressed his own hand over hers. She looked at him, at his pale face, his pained breathing, his vulnerability. He had taken a bullet for her. She met his eyes in the darkness of the small cave, her own gaze steady, resolute. "You saved me once, Jed," she whispered, her voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "Let me save you now." Time in the small cave was not measured by the sun. It was measured by the snow, the cold, and the rising heat of Jed's fever. The snow fell for 2 days, a silent, relentless curtain that sealed the mouth of their shallow shelter. It was a blessing. It hid their tracks, it hid the horse, and it hid them from the world. But it was also a prison. The cold was a living thing, a predator that seeped in through their clothes, through the rock, through their very bones. They huddled together, Mara, Jed, and the horse, the animals warm. Steady bulk was a furnace against their backs. Mara spread the buffalo robes over all 3 of them, a strange, desperate huddle of man and woman and beast, sharing breath in the frozen dark. On the 2nd day, Jed's wound, which had been a raw, shallow tear, began to turn. The flesh around it grew hot, the edges puffy and an angry, dark red. He had not complained, but Mara felt the shivers start, the fine tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. By nightfall, he was burning. The hunter was gone, replaced by a sick man. His strength a liability as his body fought the infection. Mara was terrified. She was alone in a canyon, trapped by a blizzard, with a dying man and 3 killers somewhere in the valley. She did what she could. She had the small flask from his pack, half full of whiskey. She packed the wound with snow, numbing the flesh until he gritted his teeth. His eyes squeezed shut. Then, holding him down with one hand, she poured the whiskey into the raw groove. He did not scream. He arched off the rock floor with a terrible, choked groan, his body going rigid. The smell of the alcohol and the hot, sick smell of his flesh filled the small space. He collapsed back, breathing in harsh, dry sobs.
I am sorry,
she wept, her hands shaking.
I am so sorry, Jed.
He did not answer. He was already slipping away. For the next 2 days, he was lost. He was in the cave, but he was also back in Bozeman, back at the river, back in a place of deep, dark guilt. Mara nursed him, her world shrinking to the few feet of rock around them. She melted snow in her tin cup over a tiny, smokeless fire she built from dry twigs found deep in the cave. A fire so small it was barely a handful of coals, shielded by her own body. She dribbled water onto his cracked lips. She held him when the shivers racked his large frame. She listened. His delirium was a confession, whispered to the ghosts that haunted the cave. Abel, no, he muttered, his hands clenching at the robe. He's cheating. Do not draw on him, boy. Mara wiped his face with a damp cloth, her own tears cold on her cheeks. Hush, Jed, it is all right. You are safe. His eyes, glassy and unfocused, stared through her. They'll kill you. Run, Abel, and do not look back at me. Do not look. He thrashed, his good arm pushing her away. Not a monster. I did it for you. Then, in a moment of burning stillness, his eyes found hers. He seemed to see her, truly see her, through the haze of the fever. A look of profound, heartbreaking tenderness softened his face. He lifted his hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. Mara, he breathed. He thought he was dreaming. He thought she was an angel, a vision brought by the fever. You came. I saw you. In the river. You were so bright.
I am here, Jed,
she whispered, covering his hand with hers.
I am right here.
Good. His voice was a dry rasp. Do not leave me. Please, do not leave. I love you. The words, so simple, so direct, shattered the cold. He had never said them. He had fought them, hidden from them, but the fever burned the defense away, leaving only the truth.
I love you,
he whispered again, his eyes drifting shut.
But do not watch me. I ruin everything.
He fell back into the darkness. Mara held his hand, pressing it to her lips, and kept her vigil. She would not let him go. She would not let the cold, or the fever, or the past take this man from her. He was hers. She had chosen. The fever broke on the 4th morning. Mara had drifted into an exhausted sleep, her head on his chest, and she woke to a sudden, jarring stillness. He was cool. The fire was gone from his skin. His breathing was deep and even, no longer the shallow, ragged gasps of the sick. She sat up, hope a painful, fragile thing in her chest. He opened his eyes. They were no longer glassy. They were clear, gray, and focused on her face. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in her gaunt, smoke-smudged cheeks, her matted hair, the fierce, protective exhaustion in her eyes. He remembered. The cave, the shot, the fever. He remembered flashes of her face, her hand, her voice. He tried to sit up, and a sharp pain made him grunt. He looked down at his shoulder. The wound was clean, the flesh a healthy, healing pink. The strip of her chemise was a clean, white bandage. He looked at her, and the guilt returned, colder than the snow. "You should have left me," he whispered, his voice rough. "You should have taken the horse. You would be in the next territory by now." Mara had faced down his guilt before. She had no patience for it now.
"And where would you be?"
she asked, her voice flat.
"Dead? Frozen in this rock? Is that what you wanted?"
"It is better than you being caught. I am a liability." "Stop," she said. The word was not a plea. It was a command. She knelt in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "We are done with this. I am not your brother. Jed, I am not a ghost. I am a woman, here, flesh and blood. And I am telling you, I have chosen." He just stared at her, the old arguments dying in his throat.
"My life,"
she said, her voice low and fierce,
"is mine. It does not belong to Silas. It does not belong to my father, and it does not belong to your guilt.
It is mine, and I choose to be here. I choose you. Whether that is for one more day in this canyon or for 50 years, I have made my choice. We will not speak of it again." He saw the woman she had become. The terrified bride who fell in the river was gone. In her place was this woman, as hard and resilient as the mountains themselves. He had taught her to shoot, but she had taught him to live. He reached out, his hand shaking, not from fever, but from emotion. He touched her face, just as he had in his delirium. But this time, he was awake. "Mara," he whispered, and that was all.
She leaned into his hand. "Helena," she said, "I have distant relatives. A cousin of my mother's. She owns a boarding house. I think it is a big town, big enough to be lost in. No one will know our faces there."
He nodded slowly, a faint, weak smile touching his lips. "Helena, then." The journey took 2 weeks. The world was thawing. They left the high canyon and descended into the foothills, a world of slush and mud and the sharp, clean smell of pine sap. The spring thaw was in full force. The rivers were high and angry, but the snow was gone. Jed was weak. At first, Mara walked, leading the cayuse while he slumped in the saddle. He was a dead weight, but he was alive. As the days passed, his strength returned. He began to take notice of the world again, his hunter's eyes scanning the horizon, not just for trackers, but for game. They rode together, Mara in front, tucked between his arms, his solid warmth at her back. They had one rifle, one horse, and each other. The land they passed through was merciless. This was the West, a place that promised everything and gave nothing. It was a place of bones. They passed a burned-out settlement, nothing left but 3 stone chimneys standing like skeletal fingers against the sky. A small, crude wooden cross was pushed into the muddy earth near one, marking a grave. Mara saw a child's broken doll half buried in the ash. Jed looked at it, his face grim. He saw the cruelty he knew so well. He saw the end result of men like Silas Croft, men who took and men like Elias Thorne, who cheated. The West was built on the wreckage of other people's lives. "There is no law here," he said, his voice quiet. "Just power. Then we will be our own law, Mara replied, her hand finding his on the saddle horn. They met other travelers, people hardened by that same lawlessness. They saw drifters with hollow eyes, men who had lost everything in the mines and now had nothing but the clothes on their backs. At a small, desperate trading post, they saw a woman, a widow by her black, ragged dress, mending clothes for a pinch of flour, her face blank and silent, enduring the rough talk of the freighters who passed through. Jed watched a large, loud man berate her for a torn stitch. He saw the woman flinch, her shoulders hunching. He saw her silence. He saw Mara. He saw his brother. He saw all the people who were silenced by fear or by power. He felt the old rage, the urge to step in, to use the violence that lived inside him. But he felt Mara's hand on his arm.
"Not our fight, Jed,"
she whispered.
"Not yet."
He let her lead him away. He was seeing the same cruelty that had nearly broken him. But now he was not alone. He was seeing it through her eyes, too. His solitude had been an abdication. Her companionship was a purpose. But their journey was not only hardship. In the moments between the fear of the past and the uncertainty of the future, they found a fragile, fierce joy. One afternoon, they found a small, clear river, slowed in a gentle bend. The new spring sun warming the rocks. They were covered in the grime of the cave, the sweat of the trail, the blood of the wound.
I cannot go into a town like this,"
Mara said, looking at her torn, filthy clothes. Jed dismounted. He waded into the shallows, the water shockingly cold, but clean. He turned to her. It was not a seduction. It was a baptism. They bathed in the cold river. Mara washed his back, her hands gentle as they moved over the puckered bullet scar on his ribs, then the new, healing wound on his shoulder. He washed her hair, his rough fingers clumsy in the long, dark tangles, carefully rinsing the mud and smoke away until it shone. They worked in silence, a quiet, sacred ritual of care. That night, they slept under the stars for the first of time, the high, thin air of the plains clean and sharp. The danger was still behind them, the future still unknown. But they were no longer huddled in a cave. They lay side by side, wrapped in the robes, and for the first time, they talked. Not of the past, not of the future. They talked about the stubborn horse. They laughed. A quiet, shared sound. About the way he refused to cross any stream wider than a puddle. Jed told her about the stars, pointing out the hunter and the bear. She told him about her mother, who had loved to press wildflowers in a heavy book. Their bond, forged in the terror of the storm and the desperation of the flight, was now being tempered into something else. It was no longer born of fear. It was born of understanding. They had seen each other at their worst, his guilt, her terror, and they had chosen to stay. It was a love that felt less like a romance and more like a treaty, a sacred promise signed by two survivors. They were 2 days' ride from Helena. The air felt different. It felt like hope. They were following a deep, fast-moving river, the sheer rock walls of a gorge rising on one side. The trail was narrow, forced to a ford by a collapsed railroad bridge, its skeletal timbers hanging over the churning water below. "This is it," Jed said, his voice tight. "We cross here, and we are in the valley. We will see the town by nightfall." Mara smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. She turned in the saddle to look at him, her face full of a light he had never seen. The shot cracked through the air. It was not a sound. It was a physical blow. The horse screamed, rearing in panic. Jed shoved Mara from the saddle, and they fell together, tumbling into a cluster of boulders by the riverbank as 2 more shots echoed, chipping stone where they had been. "Trackers!" Jed yelled, pulling his revolver. "Get the rifle! Stay down!" He peered over the rock. 2 men, on the ridge above them, the same 2 from the valley. A bullet whined off the rock by his head. He fired back. His revolver's cracked sharp and clean. The man ducked. "They have us pinned," Jed yelled. "They knew we would come this way." Another shot, from a different angle. The other tracker. He was on the far side of the ford, near the broken bridge. Jed fired again. He was a machine, calm, precise, deadly. He hit the man on the ridge. The man stood, his rifle clattering on the rocks, and pitched forward. "One," Jed grunted. The second man, the one by the bridge, was smarter. He was hidden, firing, pulling back. Jed was pinned, forced to keep his head down. "He is trying to keep us here." Jed muttered, "Why?" A new voice cut through the gunfire, a cold, clear voice that did not belong to a tracker. "An admirable effort, you filthy drifter, but a waste of my time." Mara froze. She knew that voice. It was the sound of her nightmares. A man stepped out from behind the bridge abutment. He was not a drifter. He wore a fine, black wool coat and a clean hat. He held an expensive, scoped rifle. It was Silas Croft. "Mara," he called, his voice calm, reasonable. "Step out. Your adventure is over. You will be disciplined, of course, but you will come home. This animal will be turned over to the marshal in Helena. Kidnapping, horse theft, he will hang." Jed looked at Mara. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror he had not seen since the first night in the cabin. "Stay down," Jed whispered. He stood up. "She is not going anywhere with you. Croft," Jed called, his voice ringing across the water. Silas laughed, a short, dry, ugly sound. "She is my wife. She is my property. She has no say in the matter." He raised his rifle, sighting on Jed. Jed fired his revolver. The two shots were simultaneous. Jed's bullet struck Silas in the arm, spinning him around with a cry of pained rage. Silas's bullet struck Jed in the chest. The impact was brutal. It threw Jed back against the boulders, a heavy, wet thud. He slid down, his revolver falling from his limp hand. "Jed!" Mara screamed. She scrambled to him. He was conscious, his eyes wide, a dark stain already spreading across his shirt. He looked at her, his expression one of awful, final guilt. "I'm sorry," he coughed. No." Across the river, Silas cursed, clutching his bleeding arm. He fumbled with his rifle, trying to reload it one-handed, his face purple with rage. He was focused on Jed, determined to finish what he started. Mara looked at Jed, bleeding at her feet. She looked at Silas, the monster who owned her, the man who would take her back to a life of silent, waking death. And the rifle was in her hands, the rifle Jed had taught her to use. She lifted it. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. She saw Silas raise his own weapon, lining up the final shot. "No," she whispered. She remembered Jed's voice. "Squeeze, do not pull, brace it, breathe." She did. She braced the rifle on the boulder. She took a breath. Her hands steadied. Silas heard the click of the hammer. He turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. He had never, not once, considered her to be real. She was an object, a thing. The shock on his face was the last thing he saw. Mara fired. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her aching shoulder. The sound of the shot was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Silas Croft was thrown backward, as if by a giant hand. He stumbled, his good arm flailing. He was standing on the very edge of the collapsed bridge, over the deep, roaring gorge. He teetered there for one long, silent second, his eyes locked with hers, a mask of pure, astonished disbelief. Then he fell. He did not scream. He simply vanished into the white churning water of the spring thaw. The river, which had birthed her new life, had claimed his old one. The canyon was silent. There was only the sound of the rushing water. Mara stood frozen, the rifle hot in her hands. She trembled. a violent bone-deep shake. Then, as the smoke cleared, she dropped the gun and fell to her knees beside Jed, her hands frantic, searching for the wound. The silence after the final shot was a void. It was deeper and more absolute than the snow-filled silence of the cabin. There was only the roar of the river below, a hungry, white noise sound that had swallowed a life whole. Mara stood frozen, the heavy rifle still warm in her hands. She was trembling, a deep, ague-like shudder that started in her knees and rattled her teeth. She had done it. She had taken a life. She had ended the hunt. But the sound, the single wet cough from the rocks below, shattered her paralysis.
Jed!
She dropped the rifle and scrambled down the rocks, sliding on the slick, wet stones. He was where he had fallen, slumped against the boulder, his back to the river. His eyes were open, his face a mask of pale, waxy shock. The front of his shirt, just below the collarbone, was a dark, spreading stain. It was not a graze. This was deep.
"Oh no,"
she whispered, her hands fluttering over the wound, afraid to touch.
"No, no, Jed, not now."
He looked at her. His gaze was clouded with pain, but in it, she saw a terrible, familiar guilt.
"I'm sorry,"
he coughed, a fleck of blood at his lips.
"He found you because of me."
"Hush," she commanded, her voice fierce, the terror replaced by a sudden, cold clarity. She ripped another long strip from her chemise, her hands no longer shaking. "You are not allowed. You are not allowed to say that. You are not allowed to leave. Do you hear me?" He looked at her, surprised by the iron in her voice. He had seen her terror, her strength, but this was new. This was the command of a woman who had just fought for her life and had no intention of losing it. She pressed the thick pad of cloth to the wound. "Hard," he gasped, his back arching, a low groan forced from his chest.
"I know,"
she whispered, her voice softening, but her hands remaining firm.
"I know, but you will hold on. We are not done. I did not do that, just to lose you here."
She held the pressure, her other hand braced on his good shoulder, her body shielding him. The canyon was still. The other tracker, the one on the ridge, was gone. Whether he was dead or had fled, she did not know. She did not care. There was only this, the man at her feet and the river at her back. The sun began to dip, the canyon walls throwing long, cold shadows. The horse, which had bolted, had not gone far. It stood 50 yards away, its head down, trembling.
"We have to go,"
Jed whispered. His voice was thin.
"Before night."
"Can you stand? Help me!" It was a nightmare. He was a heavy man, and his body was a dead weight. She got her shoulder under his good arm, taking his weight, and heaved. He cried out, a raw, sharp sound that echoed off the rocks. But he got his legs under him. He was leaning on her, his entire right side useless, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. She half dragged, half carried him to the horse. It took an eternity. Every step was a fresh agony for him. By the time they reached the animal, he was slick with sweat and his face was ashen. She could not get him into the saddle.
"I can't,"
she wept, her strength failing. "Use the rock," he panted, gesturing to a low ledge. She guided him to the ledge, and with a final, desperate burst of strength, she pushed and he rolled, slumping forward onto the horse's neck, his arms hanging limp. He was on. She took the reins, her mind racing. She looked at the bodies. The one on the ridge. Too far. She looked at Jed's revolver, lying in the mud. She looked at her rifle.
"No,"
she said, her voice hard. She walked back. She picked up the rifle. She picked up his revolver. She checked the rifle's chamber, her fingers moving with a new, grim familiarity. She shoved the revolver into the waistband of her skirt. Then she saw something else, glinting in the mud near where Silas had stood. It was his rifle. the expensive one, with the scope. She grabbed that, too. She tied both rifles to the saddle, her knots quick and tight. She looked at the river, at the churning, white water that had taken her past. "Wait," she whispered. She fumbled in the small leather pouch at her own belt, the one Jed had given her. Her fingers closed around a cold, hard circle of gold. She had not burned it. She had not been able to. She had pulled it from the cooling ashes in the cabin, a last, heavy link to the life she had been fleeing. It was a brand. She walked to a spot by the riverbank, under a small, twisted pine. The ground was soft. She used Jed's skinning knife, which she now carried, and dug a small, shallow hole. Jed watched her. His head lolled against the horse's mane, his eyes blurred with pain. She took the revolver from her waistband. His past, the gun that had killed Elias Thorne, the gun that had marked him as a killer. She placed it in the hole. Then she took the ring from her pouch. Her bondage, the price of her father's debt, the symbol of her life as property. She dropped it on top of the revolver. She covered them, gold and steel, buried together under the dark Montana soil. She packed the earth down with her hands, then rolled a heavy stone over the spot. It was done, an ending. She took the horse's reins and began to walk. She did not look back. She led the horse and the dying man away from the river, heading north toward the distant, smoky promise of Helena. They arrived in Helena 2 days later, not as survivors, but as ghosts. Mara had walked the entire way, her feet raw, her body numb with exhaustion. Jed had been unconscious for most of the journey, lashed to the saddle. She had sold Silas's fine rifle at a trading post miles south of the city, trading it for a small bag of coins, a bottle of laudanum, and a look of deep, unquestioning suspicion from the trader. She found the boarding house on a dusty street near the freight yards. It was a tall, grim-looking building, its paint peeling. She left Jed on the horse in the alley, his head hanging, and knocked on the back door. The woman who opened it was older, her face a mask of weary competence. "We are not hiring," she said, before Mara could speak. Are you Martha?" Mara asked, her voice cracking. "Martha Beale?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "Who is asking?" I am Mara. My mother was Elspeth, from Virginia City." The woman's hard face softened. "Just a fraction." She looked closer. "My heavens, Elspeth's girl? I heard you were married to Silas Croft." "I am not," Mara said, the words tasting like iron. "Please, there is a man with me. He is hurt, badly. We have money, not much, but we need a room, a place where no one will ask questions." Martha looked past Mara, into the alley. She saw the horse. She saw the shape of the man slumped in the saddle. She saw the dark stains. She saw the rifle Mara still carried. She sighed, a long, deep sound of profound resignation. "You look like your mother," she said. "She was always finding trouble. Bring him in, but not through the house. The old line cabin, out back. It is just a shack, but the roof is sound." The cabin was 2 small rooms, smelling of dust and old hay, but it had a stove and a cot. Mara gave Martha half of her coins. The woman nodded, her face grim. "I will send for a doctor, an old one. He does not talk." The doctor, a man with hands that shook from whiskey, dug the bullet from Jed's chest. He grunted, declared the lung was nicked, not torn, and said the man would live, or he would die, and it made no difference to the world. He took his fee and left. Jed lived. He lay in that cot for 3 weeks, suspended between life and death. Mara did not leave. She sat by his side, cleaning the wound, forcing broth between his lips, fighting the fever when it returned. She was no longer a nurse. She was an anchor, holding him to the world. When he finally woke, his eyes clear, his fever gone, he looked at her, She was thin, her face gaunt, her hands raw, but her eyes were steady.
"You stayed,"
he whispered.
"I told you I would," she said.
A new life began. A quiet, hard, precarious life on the edge of town. They were almost penniless. Martha, bound by a thin, old loyalty to Mara's mother, let them stay in the cabin. Jed, as soon as he could stand, began to work for his keep. He chopped wood for the boarding house, mended fences, hauled feed. He was strong, and he was quiet. He kept his head down. He spoke to no one. The men in the freight yard noted his silence. The scar on his face, the way he moved, they gave him a wide berth. Mara needed to work. She was educated. She could read, write, and cipher. The small schoolhouse at the edge of town, catering to the children of miners and laborers, needed a teacher. The pay was almost nothing, a few dollars a month and a sack of flour. She took it, and the whispers began. Helena was a town that lived on gossip. The news of Silas Croft's disappearance, of his young bride who had vanished into a snowstorm, had been the talk of the territory, and now, months later, she had reappeared. Not in silks, but in a mended wool shirt. Not in a fine house, but in a shack. And not alone. "That's her," the women would whisper in the general store, their hands over their mouths. "The runaway. They say he was found in the gorge, the river. And him, the man she lives with. That is Jed Callahan, the one who killed Elias Thorne in Bozeman, over cards. A runaway wife and a known killer. Living in sin. It is a disgrace." Mara felt the stares. She felt the chill. When she walked into the store, conversation stopped. When she went to the schoolhouse, the children would fall silent, watching her with wide, curious, fearful eyes. She was a scandal. She was the woman who had broken the rules, and the world would not let her forget it. Jed felt it too. He was the shadow behind her, the killer, the brute. Men did not meet his eyes. They did not offer him a drink. They did not speak to him. They were pariahs. They were alone, together. They endured. Jed worked. He labored from sunup to sundown. His silence a wall. He was paying a penance, not for killing Silas, but for the life he had lived before. His hands, once quick to draw a gun, were now calloused from the axe and the plow. Mara taught. She was kind. She was patient. The children, who at first were wary, began to respond to her soft voice. She taught them their letters, but she also taught them about the birds in the mountains and the names of the stars. She was gentle, and the children, who saw none of the sin the adults whispered about, began to love her. But the town was not so easily won. One Sunday, almost a year after their arrival, they were in town for supplies. The air was cold, a hint of the winter to come. As they passed the small white church, the doors opened, the congregation spilling out. The preacher, a tall, gaunt man named Reverend Gideon, saw her. He had been looking for this moment. He saw her as a direct affront to his authority, a walking symbol of sin. He stopped on the church steps. He raised a long, bony finger. "Jezebel!" he boomed, his voice carrying across the dusty street. The townspeople froze. Mara stopped, her hand flying to her throat. Jed, carrying a sack of flour, turned, his body going rigid. "There she stands," the preacher cried, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "The adulteress, the runaway, she who forsook her sacred vows and shames this town with her presence. She lives in sin with a man of blood. She is a blight on our community." People gathered. They stared. They murmured. Mara stood frozen, the color draining from her face. It was a public stoning, but with words. She was naked, exposed, and utterly humiliated. Jed looked at her. He saw her shame. He saw her pain. And he saw that the preacher was right. She was shamed because of him. He was the man of blood. He was the blight. His past, His violence was a poison, and he was killing her. Slowly, with every whisper, every stare. He was the monster, just as he had always feared. He did not speak, he did not move. He simply turned, walked back to the wagon, set the flour sack down, and untied their horse. Mara saw the movement.
"Jed, what are you doing?"
He did not answer. He swung into the saddle. He was going to ride. He was going to do the one thing he had left to do to save her. He was going to disappear. He would leave her. And the town would, eventually, forgive the widow. But they would never forgive the adulteress. He looked down at her, his face a mask of such profound, agonizing guilt that it broke her heart. "He is right," he whispered. "You deserve better than this." He was about to turn the horse, to ride out of her life forever, to fulfill the cowardice she had accused him of in the cabin. No. She was at his side, her hand on the reins, her small, strong hand gripping the leather. "Look at me," she commanded. He looked down, his eyes hollow. "We faced them," she said, her voice low, for him alone, but ringing with the strength of steel. "We faced Silas, we faced his men, we faced the snow, we faced the river, we faced hunger, and we faced bullets. We faced death, together." She put her hand on his knee, her gaze locked with his. We will not be broken by words. We will not be broken by a small man with a loud voice. You will not leave me. Jed Callahan, I did not save your life for you to throw it away." He stared at her. He saw the woman who had faced him down in the cabin, the woman who had bound his wounds in the cave, the woman who had pulled the trigger by the river. She was not a victim. She was not a shadow. She was his partner. He slowly, so slowly, took his hand from the saddle horn and covered hers. He did not speak. He swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted, standing beside her. He faced the preacher. He did lipped, his head high. Mara stood beside him, her hand sliding into his. They did not speak. They did not defend themselves. They simply stood together. The preacher, faced with their silent, unbreakable unity, faltered. His words ran out. The crowd, seeing not a cowering sinner and a violent brute, but just a man and a woman, standing against the world, grew quiet. The spectacle was over. Jed picked up the flour sack. Mara picked up her basket, and, hand in hand, they walked through the silent crowd and went home. The town did not change overnight, but the ice had cracked. Years passed. The whispers did not stop. Not entirely, but they grew softer. Time, and the quiet dignity of their lives, began to wear away the hard edges of judgment. The winter of '83 was the worst in memory. A child in a neighboring homestead was dying of lung fever. A blizzard raged, just like the one that had first thrown them together. The doctor would not ride. Jed, the only man in the valley who knew the high passes, the man they called Killer, rode for 2 days in the blinding white to fetch the medicine. He barely made it back, but the child lived. The child's father, a man who had never once spoken to him, came to his cabin and left a whole cured ham on the porch. The schoolhouse roof collapsed under the snow. Mara moved the children into their small cabin. She taught them by the fire, mending their clothes while they read, feeding them hot soup. The mothers of the town, seeing her kindness, began to send extra food. One of them, a stern woman who had led the whispers, stopped Mara in the street. "You are a good woman, Mrs. Callahan," she said, stumbling over the name. It was the first time anyone had called her that. They were never rich. They were never fully forgiven by all. They built a new, larger cabin, high on the mountainside, away from the town, but not as isolated as the first one. It was a life built by hand. Jed labored, Mara taught. They were a quiet, settled part of the landscape, like the mountains themselves. The story ends, as it began, in the snow. It was a cold winter evening. Years later, the cabin was warm. The logs chinked tight against the wind. A heavy, peaceful snow was falling outside, covering the world in a clean, white blanket. The fire was roaring in the hearth. Mara sat in a rocking chair, a quilt over her lap, mending one of Jed's shirts. She was older now. There were lines of silver in her dark hair, and her hands were no longer the pale, smooth hands of a bride, but the strong, capable hands of a survivor. Jed sat on a low stool by the fire, the same spot he had taken in that first cabin. So long ago, but he was not cleaning a rifle. He was carving a piece of pine. He was carving a small, delicate snowbird, its head cocked, just like the one she had seen through the window. His face, in the firelight, was no longer haunted. The scar was just a part of him. The lines around his eyes were from sun and time, not from guilt. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the scrape of his knife against the wood. Mara stopped rocking. She watched him, a slow, quiet smile touching her lips. The peace in the room was so thick, so earned, she could almost taste it. She put her sewing aside. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, a near whisper. "Don't leave me alone tonight." Jed stopped carving. He did not look up immediately. He finished a small cut, blowing the shaving of wood away. He looked at the bird. He looked at the fire. Then he looked up at her, his gray eyes clear and warm and full of a love that needed no words. He smiled faintly, a small, sure smile. "I'm right here, darlin'," he answered, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Always was." He set the carving on the hearth. The cabin door stayed locked against the wind. A habit now, a ritual of safety. But it was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. The storm was outside, but inside. Two souls who had been broken by the world had found their peace. Not from the storm, but in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment below and let us know where you are listening from, so we can all connect. Do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share this tale if you enjoyed it.